As you can see, this talk is entitled A Policeman's Life, the life of Samuel Hicklin, 1854 to 1924. In some ways, it's a very ordinary life, the life of a policeman in the last years of the Victorian era and in the early years of the 20th century. What makes it quite extraordinary are its starting points and its end points, as we will see. Our story starts with Arthur Samuel Hicklin being born at Hilton on the border between Derbyshire and Staffordshire, baptised in April 1858. His father was a farm labourer, and as far as we know, he was brought up in a farm labourer's cottage, and his level of education would have been fairly minimal. We next meet with him as Arthur Hicklin while he was working as a farm servant in Horninglow, roughly where that picture from Google Earth is taken. He hadn't moved far, he was really just down the road. But clearly he wished to be a policeman, and he made every effort to join the police as early as he could. Before going on, however, it's perhaps best just to say a little bit about the structure of the Staffordshire Constabulary at the time. The headquarters, not unnaturally, was in Stafford. It was divided into 3 districts, each of which were headed by a chief superintendent. The Potteries district around Stoke, the mining district in the Black Country, and the rural district everywhere else. Each district was divided into divisions headed by a superintendent or inspector. Each division was divided into subdivisions headed by an inspector or a sergeant, and each subdivision had a number of stations with sergeants and constables there. In November 1875, Arthur Samuel Hicklin was recruited into the police in the rural district. He gave his age as 18 years and 7 months. His actual age was 17 years and 7 months, and there must be a suspicion there that he had lowered his age to get into the police rather earlier than he should. He was 5 foot 8 and 5/8 inches tall, brown eyes, dark brown hair, and a fair complexion. And he told them that his previous trade had been as a labourer, a farm labourer. We first see him in the record in 1876 when he was fined £1 for being too drunk to report to duty. In other words, he was pretty much a normal 18 or 19-year-old at the time. His first posting was to the mining division, to the mining district, the Brierley Hill division, the Blackheath subdivision, and Tividale station. And here he first comes into the public record in the press. And the first we read of him is that in April 1876, Isaac Fisher was charged with being drunk on the 25th of the month and pleaded guilty. Police Constable Hicklin proved the case, and the defendant was fined 5 shillings with costs. Over the coming months, we read of him apprehending carters who were driving too quickly or not exercising proper control over their horses, of apprehending children stealing coal, bringing publicans to court for selling out of hours or encouraging drunkenness, and perhaps the highlight of his time there, bringing Joseph Evans and Benjamin Baker to trial for shooting ducks on the canal. One suspects that his private life during his time at Tividale was more interesting than his professional life, and in February 1878 he married Eliza Taylor. Eliza was the daughter of a boat builder at Braidhall Lock Cottage. They were married at Christ Church in Oldbury, and Samuel Hicklin and Eliza were to return there for the baptism of all of their children over later years. He gave his age as 20, although he was 19 at the time. And this is the last time, as far as I can tell, that he actually used the name Arthur. After Tividale, he moved in late 1879 to be a constable in the mining district. Same district, Brierley Hill division, Brierley Hill subdivision, and at Pensnett station. And indeed, this is where I first came across him in my various researches. We don't have pictures of him at the time, but he would have dressed in that sort of fashion, and he would have lived in a police house similar to that one there, in the midst of the community, very much surrounded by the people that he was trying to police, trying to look after. There, we read quite a lot about him in the press. In 1880, Sam Hicklin and another policeman concealed themselves at a pit in the area, and a crowd of mainly women and children came picking coal that was stored at the pit, stealing coal. They jumped out and arrested 26 of them, ranging from ages between 11 and 61, who were fined between 2 shillings and 6pence and 5 shillings, or 7 to 14 days in prison. And rather touchingly, we read that the charge against one Mary Angel, 13, a deaf and dumb girl, was withdrawn. Quite harsh sentences. Sam was also very zealous in terms of making sure that licensees obeyed the law. At the High Oak pub, very early on a Sunday morning in 1881, he heard voices from a house close to the pub speaking, and after secreting himself in the door of the nearby post office, saw a group of women coming out from that house to collect ale from the High Oak Inn and to take back to the house they'd come from. He naturally apprehended them, and the licensee of the High Oak, William Evans, was found guilty of keeping his house open during prohibited hours. This wasn't the only occasion of that sort by any means, and it must have been quite difficult for Samuel living in the community to find himself bringing many of the people around him to court, and he won't have been the most popular person. This came to a head in 1881 when he and another PC assisted in throwing 4 people out from a pub called the Crown. They then walked along the road to another pub called the King's Head, which was there until quite recently, to ask the landlord of that pub to serve on an inquest jury. As Hicklin went into the pub, someone was standing on a bench behind the door and hit him a number of times with a stick, and a second man assaulted him with a poker with a blow across the shoulders. Eventually, one Noah Bate, a miner from Commonside, was arrested and brought to trial in March 1882. It would appear that he and the other 3 were those who had been thrown out of the Crown pub earlier. He was sentenced to jail with hard labour for 2 months. On his way to prison in Stafford, Bate was heard to say by the accompanying police officer that he would do for that bugger Hicklin when he came out. He was further charged with using threatening behaviour and bound over to keep the peace. Now, clearly Noah Bate wasn't the sharpest knife in the block, but it does sort of illustrate the underlying current of violence that was there at that time. After a few years, Sam Hicklin moved on to become a sergeant, this time in the Potteries Division at Braidley Green Station. In 1884, in 1891, he declared his age as 36 on the census. He was actually somewhere between 32 and 33. We don't read a lot about him at Braidley Green. Perhaps the most significant thing we read was when he and another PC were charged with assaulting one Samuel Chadwick, a collier. Chadwick had clearly been drinking, and another PC had tried to arrest him and then tried to drag him to the police station. He was unable to do so, so he went to get Sam Hicklin and another constable, and between them they dragged Chadwick along the road through the middle of a large crowd and threw him into the cell. At the station, he was put into a cell and he was allegedly thrown roughly onto a bench, resulting in a black eye and other injuries. According to Sam Hicklin's statement that was reported in the press, he was laid very carefully upon the bench in the cell. The tone of the press report gives the impression the reporter didn't believe a word of it, but nonetheless, the magistrates conferred and decided in favour of the police, and Sam was able to continue his career without interruption. In late 1891, he moved on again to become an inspector, this time in the rural district. In the Burton division, he was based at Burton upon Trent Station. In other words, he was coming close to home and probably had responsibility for policing his own district. In 1895, we read that he was instrumental in arresting a travelling fraudster, someone who was going around the country pretending to be an old acquaintance of a number of leading cricketers of the day, that he was now suffering from sickness and trying to obtain donations, and then moving on very rapidly before he was discovered. Sam Hicklin was responsible for arresting him as he got off the train in Burton and returning him to Oxford, where he was wanted. In 1896, he moved what I believe was a very short-term secondment to Tipton as an inspector there. And there, his main activity seems to have been on the case of Sarah Jane Williams, who was 43, and Frederick Ward, who was 49, who were charged with the theft of significant money and property to the value of 400 from John Williams, Sarah's husband, and then eloping via Liverpool to the United States. Hicklin was entrusted with sailing to the United States in their pursuit and receiving them into his custody on board the Belgenland, which we can see there in Washington Docks in Philadelphia, and probably returned home without actually setting foot on American soil. As I say, that was a very short-term secondment, and after a few months, he returned to Burton. He returned to Burton this time as a superintendent in the rural district, Burton Division, so head of division, based at Burton Station. So the picture we have there, well, it's of interest because it shows the mounted police, which we'll see will be significant, in their uniform. The site where I obtained it from says that the figure in the foreground is Hicklin's successor at Burton-on-Trent, but the date it gives is during the period that Sam Hicklin was actually in post. So something is wrong, but there is the possibility that here we have the first picture of Sam Hicklin. He was very much at Burton a public figure. We read of him in the press, licensing public, responsible to the bodies for licensing public houses, reporting on an annual basis of the number of drunks, number of licenses, the number of convictions. Indeed, during this period, he was responsible for the licensing in the pubs in Lichfield, where I currently live. He seems to have exchanged catching drunks for counting them. We also read of him attending public functions, including kicking off a charity football match between Burton and Lichfield Police. He attended funerals, he delivered tributes. In short, he became a public representative of the police in the area. That didn't, however, stop him being involved with a whole range of cases. One of the perhaps most interesting is that in 1899, at a shop fire in Burton-on-Trent, where the owner, a Mr. Joseph North, a draper from Uxbridge Street, was unable to explain to Sam Hicklin how the fire had started at around midnight and why he and his wife were fully dressed at the time after retiring to bed early. Hicklin unsurprisingly found the fact that Mr. Richardson's attire included collar and tie and laced up boots more than a little suspicious, I think, particularly, again, when he discovered that the level of insurance that Richardson had was about 8 times the level of stock that was burnt. He was duly charged and convicted of fraud. There were a couple of incidents during his time at Birmingham which says something about the nature of Sam Hicklin. In 1900, some children were standing on the recreation ground bridge, Canal Bridge in Burton, which I believe is that bridge, although I'm not totally sure, when one of the boatmen on a passing barge shot at them from below with a pellet gun. It's likely the kids were actually throwing stones at the barge at the time. But nonetheless, 5 of the children were injured in the face and shoulders. Sam Hicklin, remember, a superintendent, now really quite senior, chased them on his horse for about 7 miles along the canal and arrested them at Olrowas. They were duly charged and convicted with causing grievous bodily harm to the children. Perhaps rather more seriously than that, in 1903, P.C. William Price, who was based at Stretton near Birmingham, was investigating the stealing of some ferrets. His inquiries led him to a gypsy encampment consisting of several caravans where he arrested a certain Tom Sheriff. Sheriff's two brothers, John and William, then attacked him with sticks and stones, and when trying to use his baton, Price was repeatedly hit and forced to the ground, where they continued to beat him. They eventually made their escape despite the efforts of Price, who tried to pursue them before collapsing. The constable was taken to Burton Infirmary and the wounds on his head dressed. Later, however, at home he became delirious and was readmitted to hospital, where a fractured skull was diagnosed and an operation performed. Price, however, died later that night. When Hicklin heard of the events, he drove a horse and a trap with one or two constables in pursuit through his home territory of Marston-on-Dove and Hilton, which we can see on the map, and caught up with the caravans at Hatton, where he arrested the group. It would seem there that he arrested the mother and father of the three brothers rather than the brothers themselves, Hope and Hattie Sheriff, and another hawker, Arkless Holland, but the three brothers had already escaped, nowhere to be found. But the fact that Hicklin drove after who could have been some very violent offenders with just one or two constables, again, speaks volumes about his bravery, I think. The runaways were eventually sighted at Stropton, about 8 miles away from Birmingham, but overpowered another constable and maltreated him when he tried to detain them. And eventually reports received them being in Derbyshire near Belper, and they were followed by the police and eventually arrested at Buxton. Hicklin and another sergeant went by train to collect them, and suitably handcuffed, they were brought back to Burton, where they met, as one might expect as they left the railway station, a very hostile crowd. They were duly taken to the county sessions and charged with murder and committed for trial at Stafford Assizes in March 1903. They were actually found guilty of manslaughter on the basis that no one could decide which of the three caused the fatal blow. But even on that charge, they were sentenced to 15 years penal servitude at the prison on the Isle of Portland, where they helped to the breakwater. After a few years in Burton, here we have the 1901 census, and just to say some things about it, Sam Hicklin's entry, we can see at the top of the page, his actual age was 42 and 43. The age he declared on the census was 46. And he and his family lived in the police station along with about a dozen constables. And although it's not easy to see, the people at the end of the entry on that census form were actually people who found themselves in the cells in the police station overnight on census night. The next major move was to become chief superintendent in the Potteries Division, based at Burslem Station. And here there is a picture of the Burslem Station at the time. Here, the major event that took place during Hicklin's time there was a miners' strike. There's a widespread strike in early July 1909 with the aim being to increase the length of the lunch break and to increase pay for Saturday working. And this involved walkouts, but also large crowds of striking miners moving around the area, aiming to force non-striking miners to join them and closing down other industries. There was a lot of violence and intimidation, and the police were very, very stretched. They, of course, stood between the strikers and the non-strikers. Hicklin himself, we read of trying to persuade a crowd of 300 to 400 miners to disperse to enable non-striking miners to go home, and was himself, the press tells us, assailed with a volley of stones. The strikes were actually settled after a few days, but after a great deal of violence, some small concessions from the employers on the length of the lunch break, but the trials for violence and riot went on for many months afterwards. In 1910, the Potteries Division went through a major reorganisation, with part of it joining with other police forces to form the Stoke-on-Trent Police Force and move out of the Staffordshire Constabulary. Hicklin, however, stayed within the constabulary and became chief superintendent at District C, a new District C based on Leek Station. And here he actually enters a rather quieter period of his life. And we read of him very much as a public functionary at the time. And again, the 1911 census, not living over the shop with all his constables at this time. Again, his actual age was 52 or 53. His declared age was 56. The last time we read of Sam Hicklin was in 1924, when we read that he reported that the number of licenses in the division was 142. No license holders had been proceeded against under the licensing laws. 52 males and 10 females were proceeded against for drunkenness, and all except 6 males and 4 females were convicted. He ended his career as he began it, dealing with drunks. Sam Hicklin died quite suddenly in March 1924, but the last years of his life were marked by honours, significant honours, the George V Coronation Medal in 1912, the MBE in 1919. The obituary that was given for him in the local press from the magistrate bench was fulsome and sincere. It stated that during his 14 years at Leek, Chief Superintendent Hicklin had made himself extremely popular with all classes by the courteous and tactful way in which he had carried out the important and various duties attached to his office. He was of a quiet and unassuming disposition and a man seeking little publicity, but was nevertheless a strict disciplinarian, and his organisation of the police in the large and important Leek division was as complete and as efficient as anywhere in the county. He was a zealous and efficient police official, carrying out his work with conspicuous ability, and whilst ever mindful of the responsibilities of his position, he was always fair and impartial in the preparation of his prosecutions. The Chief Constable wrote in the April 1924 edition of the Police Bulletin, and he wrote that he wished to express his deep and sincere appreciation of the very valuable and loyal work of the officer during his long service of 48 years in the force. He was buried in Leek after a memorial service and funeral service at Leek Parish Church, attended by very many people, including representatives of all the public authorities in the town, the magistrates' bench, the Masonic lodges of which he was a member, and by an awful number from the Licensed Victuallers Association, with whom he had, no doubt, a great deal of contact. So, as I said, it was an ordinary policeman's life, but quite an extraordinary one if you think about where it started from and where it ended. A farm labourer's son with minimal education, who presumably taught himself to read and to write and to do a lot of the administration of a complex organisation, was awarded significant national honours, and at his death was effectively at the highest level he could be within the Staffordshire force. At the time, the office of Chief Constable would always have been held by a retired army officer or someone who was, in the words of the time, a gentleman, not someone with Sam Hicklin's roots. Nonetheless, it was an extraordinary achievement considering where he had come from. There was one point, however, that I should return to. Sorry, I should have introduced his photo here. The obituary in the Staffordshire Illustrated News gave this rather blurred photo of Sam Hicklin, but it's the only picture that we can actually say truly represents who he was. I've mentioned before his habit of inflating his age. This probably came because he said he was older than he was when he entered the police force. He inflated his age at that point and thereafter felt he had to keep up the pretense to some degree. And I just wonder if all the way through his career, he was fearful to some degree that someone was going to find out. However, Samuel actually had a brother, another brother called Samuel, who was born a couple of years earlier and who died before our Samuel, Arthur Samuel, was actually born. And those of you who've done genealogical studies will know that this makes trying to plot the early years of somebody's life an absolute nightmare when the names keep changing. But I do wonder if in some ways our Samuel tried to take over the birth date of his elder brother to cover up his minor misdemeanor at the age of 17 and a half, a very small blot on a very otherwise spotless copybook. So, Samuel Hicklin, 1858 to 1924, a remarkable life, an extraordinary journey. If you want to read about it in prose with perhaps rather more detail, I've written this up in a series of blog posts on the website where this video is mounted, and I would encourage you to read them. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you've enjoyed this story. Thank you.